Again, the most salient similarities and differences the data present are not the ones to which the authors draw our attention. And in trying to neat line they try to draw between the window varieties and Pidgin Creole varieties. Now in the case of the third factor group, type of nominal reference, one is at first tempted to concede Copula et al.'s primary point, that two of the Pidgin Creole varieties, Nigerian Pidgin and non-settler Liberian English, do show high generic effects, while an opposite situation obtains in ex-slave recordings and African Nova Scotian English. But before we enshrine the stipulative claim that Creole generics always favor zero plural, note that in 5 of the 7 Creole samples, this factor group has no significant empirical effect, as is also true in Samana. And note too that the generic effect is only evident in the African-based Pidgin Creole varieties, where one might expect continuing influence from coexistent African languages. In the case of the final factor group, animacy the noun, the favoring effect of inanimates on zero marking in virtually all the Pidgin Creole varieties, and its insignificance in the ex-slave recordings of all the diaspora varieties, does provide support for Copula et al.'s claim that we are dealing with different kinds of conditioning here. But a few matters remain to be clarified, and I don't have time to clarify all of them. First of all, note that animacy has no significant effect in at least one Pidgin Creole variety, Jamaican Creole 3, and that in an earlier Jamaican Creole data set not tabulated here, the constraint effects will reverse, with human nouns favoring zero plural more than inanimate ones did. Okay, then I have a long discussion about its inanimate, animate, or human, non-human, and so on and so forth, but I leave that out. Finally, even granting this one case, generally see 2 cases where the constraints on zero marking, the window varieties, differ from those in Pidgins and Creoles. This does not argue decisively against Creole ancestry and for English ancestry. Apart from the fact of the much greater frequency of zero marking in these window varieties, note that not a single one of the constraints on zero plural, which the authors themselves report as characteristic of historical or present-day varieties of English, that is, the collectivization or antinominal effect, the lexical effect of nouns of weight, measure, money, and so on. None of these factors was found to be operative in the ex-slave recordings, Samana English, or African Nova Scotian English. I'll take 1 minute to just make a couple of very quick points. I think all of us are indebted to Copula and her colleagues for the detailed quantitative analyses they provided of key variables in the window varieties and for their comparisons with constraint patterns with Pidgins and Creoles and other varieties of English. But the fact is we need more analyses of Pidgin Creole varieties. It's simply impossible to do the comparisons on languages for which we don't have comparable data, and that's true for everything but plural marking and copula assets. Secondly, we need a deeper analysis of the West African patterns. The only place in that book in which we get some discussion of West African patterns is in the chapter on plural marking. And even there are a number of mysteries, so that some of these factors do seem to come clearly from African sources, but we have a lot more to discover about how those work. Thirdly, I think my esteemed colleagues, Copula et al., need probably to have a little more willingness to give on some points. That is when you read a typical article at this point. The conclusions are always overwhelmingly in favor of the Anglicist hypothesis. And there are devices like the moving around of Liberian settler English in terms of where it falls that suggests that maybe they're not being totally honest about points of support or don't support their argument. And I think the rest of us probably need to be less willing to take. That is, we are presented in this book with a remarkable set of quantitative analyses, but a lot of us have just thought, well, this is wonderful. The more closely we look at some of these quantitative analyses, we see that some of the points are confirmed, but that some others don't really hold up as well as scrutiny. I think I'll stop there rather than trying to do that because it's all a nice phrase to end all of it and take a few minutes for us.
We only have about 8 minutes until the plenary starts downstairs. happen either. Nouns of weight measure like 1 out of every 1,000 kilograms or something like that. And I'm sure we all agree that working with this many numbers, dealing with these folks would be a really good idea. Thank you.
You must have had something else you wanted to say. Well, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
I think you touch on a deeper issue, John, and that is the whole history of African American English has historically been such a contentious one. And part of it is because we get involved in naming positions. And once we get involved in naming positions, it's a matter of who's right and proving other people wrong. We ought to be more like cancer researchers. We have a problem, we're trying to solve the problem, and we want to get all the data that we can to solve the problem. So it's not so much a matter of who's right and who's wrong, but a group of social linguists are trying to solve the problem of the history and development of one of the most important varieties ever to exist in the American English language. And that's the spirit which I think ought to push this forward rather than, I think, in particular, in terms of this topic in Southern American English, has been too subject to our egos rather than searching for solutions.
I think that's true. That's true of all of us, That's true of all of us. I was actually, the thing is, of course, trying to understand it, because I was very struck by the way, that added new data, the animacy. You got this very strong animacy factor that's right here. But again, it's more complicated because if you go further, start looking at animals versus humans versus inanimates, in the sense of the full distinction, it gets a lot more complicated. There's some appeal, for instance, that there are very commendably to Humvee's animatist hierarchy, but then it doesn't quite work out because animals don't pattern the way they should. So, but I think you're right. I like the analogy of cancer because, of course, presumably something really depends on it, other than our careers or our statuses. I don't want to be asserting that animacy is irrelevant, despite the data. If somehow these varieties are depending for their life or death on my assertion. But there's a lot. I guess part of the reason I'm saying this, and I think we need to emphasize this, is because, as some people say, we lurch from consensus to consensus. So we lurch from,